To the thousands of holidaymakers that come streaming down the motorway, Devon is cream teas. Rolling moorland and beautiful sandy beaches. To the seaman, however, the rugged cliffs and rocky bays hide both beauty and a menace that stretch down through the ages. For here, concentrated in just a few miles of coastline, lie Devon's real treasures. If you imagine a bath the size of an area from Prawl Point to Rame Head, and you pulled out the plug, you could just about walk from one place to the other over the remains of wrecked ships. From Bronze Age boats to P&O liners, the seas off Devon hide and preserve them all. So how do you find a shipwreck? Where do you start looking? Well, libraries are a good place, but graveyards are better. High above the sea sits Marlborough Church. In its graveyard, amongst its memorials, lies a small slate stone dated 1757. Covered in moss, its inscription is only just legible, but it marks the last resting place of those who perished in the East Indiaman, the Dragon. Homeward bound from Jamaica to London, the Dragon, caught out in a fierce storm, was swept aground under Lantern Rock. As the ship was smashed to pieces, 3 children from the owner's family and 4 of the crew were drowned. When we started looking for this wreck, we did not expect to find very much. After all, over the years, storms would have scattered most of the remains of a wooden boat, and the sand covered the rest. Still, we knew almost the exact location of the Dragon, so we were confident that we should be able to find its anchors, maybe some personal artifacts, and even a cannon or 2. We were in luck. Almost at once, we stumbled upon an anchor that was half buried in the sand. Our initial surge of excitement, however, soon became tempered by the discovery that this anchor was from a ship of a much later period than the East Indiaman. Most ships of the Dragon's period had anchors with wooden stocks and much wider flukes. This was all metal. So there was no getting away from it. This anchor was not the Dragon's. So where had it come from? As we swam through the weed closer into shore, we came across a deep gully strewn with large rocks. At the end of this gully, lying on a sandy bed, was a large piece of iron wreckage that looked like part of the deck ribs of a small steamship. Further on, right underneath the towering cliffs, lay more iron wreckage scattered all along the base of the huge rocks. Around the next boulder, we found a massive engine block, final proof that the wreck we had found was a steamship. But which one? As we explored the wreck, we enlisted the help of a local historian who came up with a ship, and more importantly, a name, the Devonshire. The Devonshire was built in Workington in 1919 and was a coaster of about 800 tons. In 1929, she was on a voyage from Fleetwood to London, loaded with a cargo of soda. Caught out in a blinding snowstorm, the Devonshire lost her way and ran straight into the cliffs under Lantern Rock. The crew of 13 were only rescued after clinging to the doomed vessel for over 7 hours. Eventually, all the crew were delivered to Hope Cove, where, in the words of their captain, they were given a bloody good feed. They had certainly earned it. So why didn't we already know about the Devonshire? And where was the dragon? Well, all our information had led us to believe that, like so many other shore wrecks, the Devonshire had been refloated and saved. It was the local historians who supplied the proof of her demise. Tucked away in an archive were some old photographs showing the wreck being scrapped at the bottom of the cliffs. We never did find the dragon, but without her gravestone providing the first piece of the puzzle, we would never have looked under Lantern Rock, and so would never have found the remains of the Devonshire. Between Bolt Head and Bolt Tail lie 5 miles of the most treacherous seas in Devon. So many ships have been wrecked under its forbidding cliffs that their rusting remains lie scattered almost nose to tail along the seabed. Wrecks like the Blesk, which had the distinction of being the first oil tanker in history to become a total loss, and the Jebba, an African mail ship with a cargo of ivory and over 150 passengers on board. They were all saved by the Hope Cove lifeboat and the incredible bravery of 2 men, Isaac Jury and John Argent, who risked all by scrambling down the 200-foot cliffs in the pitch dark to rig 2 bosun's chairs. How the ghosts of past shipwrecked sailors must have stirred, because 140 years previously, these 2 men's own grandfathers had scrambled down the same cliffs to rescue the pitifully few survivors from the 90-gun warship Ramillies, which was smashed to matchwood, drowning over 700 men. Not far away, on a beach under Bulbury Down at low tide, can be seen the boilers of the Jane Roe, wrecked in 1914. She is entwined with the wreckage of a steam drifter, the Charter, which hit those same boilers nearly 20 years later in 1933. Further still along the coast at Steeple Cove lie the remains of the Spanish freighter Cantabria, wrecked in the early hours of the 13th of December 1932. She was heavily laden with iron ore, outward bound from Bilbao to Newcastle. Caught in thick fog, the skipper completely lost track of his position and ran straight into the coast. All the crew was saved by the Salcombe lifeboat, but for the Cantabria, there was to be no salvation. The sea pounded her to pieces, and she disappeared beneath the waves. But it is Sawmill Cove, with its guardian, the Hamstone, that has collected more shipwrecks than almost any other part of this coast. In 1887, the famous tea clipper Halloween bounced off the Hamstone in mountainous seas to break up in Sawmill Cove, spilling her 1,600 tons of tea right across the cove in a 12-foot-high barrier. Most of the Halloween now lies buried, like the dragon, under 25 feet of sand. Probably the most famous ship in the world at the time that she stranded, the Herzogin Cecillie was the very last windjammer to be wrecked on the Devon coast. But you'll not find her in Sawmill Cove, because when she hit the Hamstone in January 1936, she was lucky to be floated off 7 weeks later, relatively undamaged, and was towed around to Starhole Bay at the entrance to Salcombe Harbour. The Duchess, as she was affectionately known, was a 4-masted steel bark, 314 feet long, with a gross tonnage of just over 3,000 tons. This Russian sail training ship is almost the same length and very similar to the Duchess. Used as a cadet ship for the North German Lloyd Line, the Duchess was interned in Chile during the Great War. Afterwards, she was allocated to France by the War Reparations Board and eventually passed into Finnish ownership. But it was the Australian grain races that made her famous. She won 8 of them in succession and became one of the most celebrated and romantic ships in the world. In 1936, the year started full of hope for the Duchess. She arrived in Falmouth stuffed full of grain 86 days after leaving Port Lincoln in Australia. Her nearest rival, the Pommern, was 7 days behind her, and the Duchess was ordered to Ipswich to unload the bulk of her cargo. 2 days later, in thick fog and rough seas, the Duchess struck the Hamstone a glancing blow and lurched to ground in Sawmill Cove. Holed in the forepeak, the ship was pounded fiercely, then settled by her head with her decks awash. For 7 weeks, the Herzogin Cecillie lay stranded in the cove whilst her 4,500 tons of grain rotted and fermented. Finally, on the 19th of June, the Herzogin Cecillie floated clear and was towed out to sea. The local council still would not let her be towed into Salcombe, fearing all manner of disease, so in the end, the Duchess was beached in Starhole Bay. Unfortunately, what appeared to be a safe and sandy bottom concealed rocks, and in the summer gales, the Duchess broke her back and her masts soon tumbled down into the sea. Today, the remains of the Duchess lie in about 25 feet of water. You can just see her shadow on the sand at low tide from the cliffs above Starhole Bay. She's well broken up now. Even so, what is left provides plenty of scope for exploration. This huge mast lies supported across wreckage buried deep in the sand. You can still see the shackles and rings that hauled the sails up this gigantic pole. What really makes this wreck exceptional are the tunnels. Various parts of the deck and hull have fallen down in such a way as to make iron tunnels in the sand. Even underwater, light penetrates through the holes in the roof. Silver air bubbles lie trapped in the metal ceiling. Over all shines a ghostly green light. Although the Herzogin Cecillie will always be remembered as one of the great square riggers of her day, it is as a wreck site that she really lives up to her old name of the Duchess, because underwater, she's still a real charmer. Away to the north lies the vast reach of Bigbury Bay, which in the old sailing days was often mistaken for Whitsands Bay, with dire consequences. Amongst its many wrecks is the War Buffalo, a merchantman torpedoed during the Second World War and better known today as the Persia. And the Totnes Castle, a paddle steamer recently rediscovered after sinking whilst on tow in 1967. The bay is also well known for its dolphins, which are regular summer visitors. But it is the great seaport of Plymouth that beckons beyond the bay. The cradle of the Royal Navy, Plymouth has seen many triumphs. But what the sea gives, it also takes away. And around the turn of the century, before the breakwater was built, Plymouth was far from the safe harbour that she is today. Unprotected from southerly gales, wreck after wreck was driven across the Sound to smash onto the shore. In 1896, the steamer Ariel ran aground in front of the Hoe. She managed to be refloated, only to be torpedoed in the Bay of Biscay 20 years later. Even today, with all the modern aids to navigation, ships still get wrecked inside the Sound. This is all that's left of the coaster Philrix, wrecked in Jennycliff Bay in 1984. She was carrying a cargo of stone which shifted position, and over she went. Coincidentally, she sank just yards from a freezer trawler, the Nordsee, which had sunk some years earlier. After a lot of failed attempts, this ship was salvaged 2 years after going down, showing that sometimes the sea does not have its own way. Built in 1848, the breakwater ensured that Plymouth would become one of the most important naval dockyards in England. However, as soon as it was built, ships started to wreck themselves along its mile-long shore. This four-masted barkentine, the Yvonne, was driven onto the breakwater by hurricane-force winds in 1920 and became a total loss, as did this hopper barge in 1913. The Abelard was a converted steam trawler built in 1909 in North Shields. At the beginning of the First World War, she was requisitioned by the Navy to be used for general duties and minesweeping. Late on Christmas Eve 1916, she struck a floating mine and quickly sank to where she now lies. Thankfully, all the crew escaped, but further along the breakwater towards the lighthouse lie the remains of a Lancaster bomber, and her end was far more tragic. The U-boat pens at Lorient are of massive construction, withstanding everything that the Allies could throw at them. But in 1943, the RAF decided to have one last attempt and assembled a huge bombing raid. Amongst all those aircraft was a Lancaster from 49 Squadron. The attack was made in 2 waves, and the devastation was enormous. They said you could see the glow from the fires 160 miles away. Even so, the pens still stood, and the RAF's casualties were horrific. This Lancaster was badly hit, but had managed to disengage and struggle across the dark seas towards Plymouth. So severe was the damage that the bomber could not maintain enough height, and the pilot decided to try for a crash landing in the Sound. By now, flying out of control, the Lancaster hit the breakwater head-on, killing all the crew outright. Today, there is still a surprising amount left of the bomber. The biggest pieces are the aero engines, and the rest is well scattered underneath the huge concrete blocks that are regularly dropped on the wreck site and are part of the breakwater's continuing sea defences. Soon, like the pilot and crew, all will disappear. Just over a mile south of the breakwater lie Rennie Rocks, guarded on the seaward side by a gaunt rock called the Shagstone. Looking at it in daylight, it is hard to see how any ship could fail to avoid it. But over the years, even with the provision of a beacon, the Shagstone has steadily taken its toll of vessels, usually at night, and more often than not in thick fog. Even though the water around the Shagstone is no more than 45 feet deep, the thick kelp helps to conceal the remains of 3 wrecks. By far the largest wreck here is the P&O liner Nepaul. Built in 1876, she was 375 feet long and was used as a mail and passenger ship. Luckily, when the Nepaul crashed into the Shagstone, most of her passengers had already disembarked in France, and those left behind were all saved. As the Nepaul careered across the rocks, she ripped out her bottom. So today, large pieces of her stern and masses of broken condenser pipes can be found scattered around the rocky seabed. This dogfish is actually swimming over the broken pieces of a boiler, which is so smothered in kelp it is unrecognizable. Further along, in a small clearing, lies a large cast-iron lump shaped like a huge wheel, on top of which is an iron podium with a close-fitting brass cap. After much cleaning and searching around the area, the divers are still no nearer to finding out which part of the wreck it came from. The consensus is that it seems to be part of the steering gear. Another look underneath the kelp did not provide any more clues, but it did yield up something that is often found on this wreck site, a small pottery ink pot, a nice souvenir of a very interesting wreck. Right between these rocks, at the bottom of the Shagstone, lies a small cave, in which can be seen an anchor and part of a winch, all that remains of the steamer Constance. She struck in thick fog in January 1888 and ripped out all her bottom as she rode up the rocks. The ship's boat was lowered, but as it hit the sea, the Constance gave a huge lurch. 2 men were thrown out of the boat and were smashed to death on the rocks. A third was swept screaming out into the darkness, never to be seen again. But the 4th was hauled back into the boat, and with the rest of the crew was saved. For a ship of 880 tons and some 209 feet in length, there's not much left of her, except pieces of broken pottery and the odd door handle, a grim reminder of the destructive forces of the sea. The Glen Strath Allen, however, is a completely different type of shipwreck from the others around the Shagstone because she was deliberately sunk. Although most of the wreckage now lies scattered on the seabed, her boiler still stands intact, except for a hole in the side which houses a large colony of pouting. Built in 1911 as a steam trawler, the Glen Strath Allen was later used as a luxury yacht by her millionaire owner Cubby Colbin, who had ordered that after his death, if no useful purpose could be found for his ship, then it should be taken out to sea and sunk. After his sudden death in the late 50s, and until about 1970, she was used as a training ship for merchant seamen. But she was now getting old and very expensive to maintain, so Colby's wishes were honoured, and the Glen Strath Allen was sunk near the Shagstone so that she could be used as an underwater class by the Fort Bovisand Diving Centre. On the 27th of April 1970, her seacocks were opened and down she went. Unfortunately, she became a hazard to the local fishing fleet, and in the end, Trinity House ordered the wreck to be flattened and dispersed. This was a great shame because it meant that its full potential as an undersea classroom was never realized. Even so, hordes of divers have poked and prodded through the Glen Strath Allen's rusty remains. Between the Shagstone and Rame Head lie the shoals of the Tinker and the Nap. Although some small ships have been wrecked here, their remains have been well broken up and scattered by years of storms. Ever since Plymouth has had a dockyard, they have been dumping their rubbish around these shoals, and so you never quite know what will turn up. Bottles and pots like these are quite common, as is cutlery. Historically, it is all relevant because most of what is found was once made at local factories in Plymouth. This Great War navigation buoy was an unexpected surprise when it loomed out of the murk. Considering that it's nigh on 100 years old, it is still in reasonable condition. How it was sunk, we should probably never know, but storms are the most likely answer. Near one of the old anchor blocks, the diver comes across a large porthole glass. It weighs nearly 15 pounds, and you would expect to find the brass porthole that went with it. But this glass was most likely placed in an iron rim, and it has now rusted away. Further out near the Draystone, the bottom changes again and becomes much darker and deeper. Here, in 105 feet, on a sandy bottom, lies the wreck of the steam trawler the Elk, a boat that is typical of the many small craft that were used as minesweepers during the two wars. Around major dockyard ports like Plymouth, these former fishing boats did all the routine and unpleasant tasks that were vital if the port was to be kept safe. Although they were not as glamorous as the destroyers or the escort carriers, the risks were much the same, and very many of these tough little craft were blown up by mines, torpedoed, or sunk by enemy aircraft. Often, the only record of a ship's passing was a terse line in the Navy's official loss list. One such entry is dated 27th November 1940 and refers to the trawler Elk. She led quite an ordinary life, fishing out of Grimsby, until the outbreak of the First World War. Then, she was taken by the Admiralty and sent to the Dardanelles to help with the evacuation of the British Army in 1918. At the end of that war, she was repatriated, and for the next few years carried on fishing from Milford Haven. However, the outbreak of the Second World War meant that once again the Elk was taken over by the Navy. Her career was to be short. One dark November night, she struck a mine and swiftly sank. Whether there was any loss of life is unknown. Later research into this wreck turned up these photos of the proud owner, the crew, and their children out on a day trip. It's sad to think that the sacrifices that these people made have largely gone unrecognized. Just around Rame Head, at the beginning of Whitsands Bay, lies one of the most popular wrecks in Britain. The James Egan Layne was torpedoed in 1945. She's a large vessel, over 300 feet long, lying upright on a sandy bottom in a sheltered bay. One of her masts used to stick above the surface, so she was easy to find. Down in the holds is a vast carpet of iron debris 3 or 4 feet deep in places. It's easy to get to as part of the engine room deck has fallen in. Amidships, this vast hold is in danger of complete collapse. You can see how the support beams have bent out of shape. But the bows are still intact and stand like a cliff covered in dead men's fingers and anemones. At the top, tied to the bow rails, is a small buoy used by novice divers to lower themselves into the forward section. Here lies a vast jumble of long-forgotten war stores, rotting batteries, bunches of electric cables, pickaxe heads and steel containers all lie as if scattered by some giant's hand. This is the Jeremiah O'Brien, docked in her home port of San Francisco. She is the only example of a working Liberty ship left, and even though she is now a museum piece, she still regularly goes to sea, and on the last VE Day's celebrations sailed across the Atlantic to the beaches off Normandy. In 1943, ships like her and the James Egan Layne were built by the Americans in their hundreds to carry stores across the Atlantic to a beleaguered Britain. Call them Liberty ships, said President Truman, and the name stuck. With a contract life of only 3 years, many carried on for 20 years or more, but most were caught and sunk by the U-boats. Even so, nobody could have predicted that this wreck would have an afterlife. It is not often that inanimate objects become legends, but the James Egan Layne is one. She has transcended her rusting frame and collapsing ribs to become a source of wonder and delight to thousands of divers from all over the world. But soon, the sea will take her back completely, as it will all the other wrecks, and only the fading remains of their deeds will remain.